house, and if any Indian tries to stop me, I'll blast him.
You know, the only thing more pathetic than Indians on TV is Indians watching Indians on TV.
Hey everybody, it's Ian. It's time for another episode of Native Film Talk, and today we're talking about Reservation Dogs, episode 6. I took a little bit of a break. Thank you so much for bearing with me, but I just wanted to get back into it and, resume and finish off this home stretch of Reservation Dogs Season 1. So, this was a good episode of hunting. You know, this was directed by Sterling Harjo, written by Sterling Harjo. Sterling Harjo was also under the costume that was Tallman in the episode, so we can talk a little bit about that. But this episode was fun for me because I'm an outdoorsman. I hunt, not until my adult years I started hunting, but fishing, I grew up my entire life fishing. You know, ever since I was a kid, my dad took me fishing, and, you know, outdoors, you know, being an outdoorsman, outdoors person, it's, you know, hunting and fishing, same thing. Thankfully, to Silence of the Lambs, I eventually learned, like, it's the same thing. You're still trying to lure and catch bait and track bait, or track your game and lure it in and take the kill. So I saw a lot of similarities with, you know, my limited hunting experience, but also with fishing. Of just like, it captures the mundane parts of hunting and fishing, which is the waiting. And really the best part of hunting and fishing is bonding with who you're with. If you've never done it, if you've never been out there, what you saw, you're just like, man, they're just spending a whole lot of time sitting around and waiting. I mean, that's what it is mostly. And that's when you have the most deep conversations with the people that you know. If you've ever been fishing, if you've ever been hunting, the long trip on the road, the hike to the site, sitting there waiting, you eventually have nothing to do but sit next to the person that you went with and talk to them about life, talk to them about what's going on in their life. And this was a great example of that, when you have Leon talking to his daughter Willie Jack, and, you know, the circumstances around Daniel's death, how they feel about it, but also really what has transpired to have Leon be skittish, why he doesn't want to go out anymore. And I'll talk about Tallman. But let's do a quick cast review. So we got John Proudstar, who is Leon. We did see him earlier in episode 2 with the IHS hospital, but we didn't really get too much of him to the extent that he is in this one. So Leon actually, so he's Yaqui, and he is Latino, he's Jewish, he's Mayan, he's a lot of things. But he's from Tucson, actually. He's from Tucson, Arizona, and he's a film actor. He's an actor. He's a director. He's a comic book writer. He actually was he was in the Sundance Writers Labs in 1998. He was at the Sundance Directors Lab in 2005. Unfortunately, there's not too much of a filmography available from him online, but it seems like this guy has been in the industry for a while, you know, doing comics, writing, directing, acting. So it's really good to see someone like him, really just a new face, a fresh face. He has been in, like, Walker, Texas Ranger back in 1998. He was in Sterling Harjo's other work, 4 Sheets to the Wind, that feature film in 2007. He was in Into the West in 2006. So other than that, there's not a whole lot that I know him from, that I've seen him from. All the other pieces of work that are in his filmography, not familiar with it. And then we get finally really a kind of a longer introduction into who Daniel is, or at least a glimpse into who this person was. And Daniel is Willie Jack's cousin. So it seems like Leon's either brother or sister had a kid, Daniel. And it sounds like Daniel has a really rough home life. From what we learned in episode 7, Daniel has a lot of domestic violence going on. He has issues. We don't get any glimpse into what exactly those issues are, but it just sounds like he doesn't have a great home life. And, you know, when you have a situation like that, where you live kind of near your cousins, they just kind of spend more time with you, and that's what happened. And in my home, I never learned the term cousin, sister, cousin, brother. I never learned that until I was around, like, Bill Agana's, basically. Because to me, everybody was my brother, everybody was my sister, like, all of my cousins. That's just how it was in my family. That's how it was in my community. Like, growing up in a Navajo community, like, it was really weird to say, oh, that's my cousin. But, like, oh, that's my brother, that's my sister. And you kind of, like, the people that you met every once in a while, you would call them cousin. But, like, the ones that you grew up with day to day, you saw them all the time, like, those are your brother and sister. So you definitely could see that connection with Willie, Jack, and Daniel, and even with Leon, you could tell that even though it was his nephew, he definitely looked at him like a son and definitely took more ownership than he should have with his death. So going back to him, Dalton Kramer, who is playing Daniel, this is his first role from what I can tell. So shout out to Angelique Midthunder and Midthunder Casting for finding him, for finding Lane Factor, who played Cheese, because this is both of their first role ever. So awesome work to find new talent, and hopefully we get to see him more in the show as it goes on in flashbacks, but also in other pieces of work. So now that we introduced the two characters that we haven't really seen, we all know Willie Jack very well, so I'll just dive right into it. This episode opens with a flashback so it sounds like the timeline is, in episode 7, Alora is hanging out with Daniel. And they go to that they go to that country bar, and he calls it a honky tonk, but they go to that country bar and they hang out, they dance, and then eventually, Daniel kind of has his moment where he, goes off on one of the guys in there, and they get kicked out, and then they part ways, Alora and Daniel. And on his way back home, he stops in episode 6 to Leon. He stops to see Leon, and Leon's loading up corn in the back of his truck because that morning he's going to go off to the hunting site and put out a bag of corn for deer. And that's the last time anyone saw Daniel alive, from what we understand, because after that he goes and commits suicide. But what was interesting is they really delve into the spirituality and kind of the mysticism of Native people, because that following morning, this episode opens up with Leon not knowing that, at this point, Daniel has not been discovered yet. Daniel had hung himself near the gang's hideout, but nobody has known yet, because it's first thing in the morning, and Leon heads out to put that bag of corn out. And while he's putting that bag of corn out, Tallman approaches. And as we see later on in the episode, it's revealed that Tallman is probably Daniel's spirit. So at this point, Daniel has passed away, and Daniel comes and sees Leon in the form of Tallman. And I'll go into a little bit about what I know about Tallman, but from what I read online, it's supposed to be tall as hell, like 12 to 15 feet tall. And like I said, Sterling Harjo is in that costume, in the suit that is Tallman, that has the red eyes. But Tallman has been in different cultures, different Native cultures, but from what I've seen, he's been a protector, but also a dark spirit tied to death. So, in real interesting story I found online is similar, like stories of the dark spirit. In 2014, on the Pine Ridge Res, there were stories of Tallman being present during that time in 2014, because during that year, youth suicide specifically, was at an all-time high. And so it appears that it could be a blend of two Tallman legends, who is a protector, but also potentially a dark spirit, because throughout this episode, you don't know if this thing is good or bad. If this thing is out to get you, or if this thing is like really ominous, if it's Bigfoot, you don't know. I don't have a Tallman in Navajo culture, as far as I know. I've never heard of Tallman. But after Leon puts that feed down, he just freaks the fuck out, and he's just like, I'm out. And he just bounces. And flash to a year later, Willie Jack is getting up, gets up before her dad, 4:30 in the morning. Also, real quick aside, if you need to go back, please go back. When she rolls out of bed and she has that quilt thrown on her, that's such a grandma auntie quilt that they made for you. I love that quilt. I have that quilt. Everyone has that quilt. But anyway, she gets up, makes coffee, looks at Daniel's picture, said she's gonna go hunt with Dad. They're gonna go find Chunk, and that they saw on the She pulled some footage from a trail camera out at the site and saw that Chunk's still out there. Chunk is their big buck that they saw one time and they never got to take a shot at. She's like, I'm going to get Chunk this year. And, his picture is hanging in their living room, in their dining room. And it's below the white Jesus, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. But, it just shows how close these two were. They were cousins, but they're really like brother and sister. And I mentioned, it's like, how many siblings do you have growing up? It's like, oh, I got like 10, 12. And it's just like, what? You have that many? It's like, well, I really have two brothers and then all these other cousins that I call brothers and sisters. And that's kind of like what it's like in Native communities. And other communities might have that, but more specifically, I've met more Native people that have to that don't have to differentiate between like brother and sister, because you grow up in the community a lot of times where you're like living down the street in the same town and you have never left, or your families have always been there, and you all grow up, just on the same dirt roads, the same playing with the same toys, and just, that's just how it is. And I love that they show that with Willie Jack and Daniel. And she looks at Daniel's picture and imagines him sitting at the table, and she's just like, I'm gonna do it this year, I'm gonna get Chunk. And then she casually looks up above, sees a picture of Jesus sitting in the moonlight with a halo over his head. And she's just like, "Sup, what, Jesus?" And just takes a sip of her coffee and walks off. And it's just like, I have those in my grandparents' house. A giant picture of the daily bread prayer, or the old man praying over his Bible with the loaf of bread in front of him, or the praying hands with like the aura of light around them, the Last Supper drawing framed. Like, this has been in all of my grandparents' homes. And it's just like that one glimpse is such a telling of how influential boarding schools were on our older generation, and how it's still present in our communities today. I mean, I mentioned those 3 pictures. A bunch of Native people listening right now, probably in their aunties, uncles, grandmas, grandpas' homes. They were either gifted to them or they kept them. The heavy influence of Christian and Catholic influence from the boarding school era, it's real. And it causes this weird fusion of religion, because if you go in Indian country, in some places, a lot of places, you'll see this like blending of like Native culture and church, where you'll have white Jesus in the home, just like that picture is, but also you'll have like braided sweetgrass sitting around. You'll still burn sage. You'll still have a medicine man come over, and it's like this odd blend between the two. And so much of that is, just shown in that one, "Sup, white Jesus" quote with the picture in the home, but also at the very end when they do a flash to Daniel's funeral, and after he kills himself at the very end, there's a Creek hymn being sung. It's a Christian hymn, but it's like it's sung in Creek. Like, even that, like, there's like, we have our traditional kind of Christian songs that are converted into Navajo, Hopi, Creek in this case, Muskogee. Like, there's just so many different layers to this transformation that we're experiencing. And the funny "Sup, white Jesus," now that we've kind of matured in our understanding of kind of like the whitewashing of the church, and understanding that we were purposely sold the idea that Jesus was white and this, that, and the other. So now like the younger generation like kind of knows that kind of like propaganda that was pushed. So now he's like, "What's up, white Jesus?" So Willie Jack is like that younger generation that's become like wise to it and like understands, kind of the influences of why that's there, and how that necessarily isn't true. It isn't, but that's the image we were pushed, is that, white is right. That's kind of what we were pushed on, and our hair is bad, and we shouldn't have long hair, and we shouldn't be practicing our culture. So it was a really subtle nod to that whole dynamic, and I really enjoyed that piece. So after that, Willie Jack goes and wakes up her dad. And her dad, at this point, he's like not about it. He's just reluctantly wakes up. He's just like, I'm not really, first day of hunting season. He's not even excited. It seems like in the past he was all about it, And then so they get up, they head to the site, and Leon's trying to give Willie Jack some, same old lines of like, you see a dog in the road, you run it over. So many accidents are caused by people swerving, and then they finally get to the site. And this is where Leon freaks out a little bit. You can see him because he's trespassing. We learn that this is private land. He kind of like lifts up a barbed wire fence, and then barbed wire fence crawls through and then goes into the hunting area. But that's where he saw Tallman. And so he's like skittish and he's kind of freaked out. And he doesn't tell Willie Jack about it. But this is interesting to me because this hunting sequence, for those of you that don't hunt or don't know a whole lot about hunting, how the Game and Fish regulates all that stuff, I'm fortunate enough to live on a large res. Navajo Nation is the size of West Virginia. So I've only applied and drawn for res deer and elk tags on my res. There's no private property on the res because it's all reservation land. It's all held in trust by the federal government. So nobody technically owns any of it. At least none of the tribal members own any of the land. They'll lease it from like the land office, from the government, but it's all held in trust to us. So technically there's no land, therefore there's no private property. But this is different. In Oklahoma, Indian country is everywhere, but there's a struggle of like who owns what. And in this one, I really like this episode because Leon talks about it. He's like, my family, my great grandfather sold this land that they hunt on, back in the 30s. And ever since then, they still count it as their land, but these Texas ranchers went and bought it from him in the 30s, and they've passed that down. That's how they pass wealth, very much like, they just pass that generational wealth on to the next people. And so these Texas ranchers have owned it since the 1930s, and that's their homeland. Even though it's technically not owned by them anymore, it's still their homeland. It's their ancestral homeland. These Texas ranchers have owned it. The stamp, the owning of it, the piece of paper that says they own it for just 80 years roughly. But for time immemorial, Leon and his ancestors have hunted on that land, have lived off that land. So for him, he's like, I feel entitled to this. I feel maybe not necessarily entitled is the right word, but it's like this is our land. This is our people's birthright. This is our people's way of life. This is how we survived for generations before this was ever a thing, before ownership was ever a thing in this country. So there's nothing like this on my res. You don't have private land. People say there is, but there isn't. There is no private land. Just because you put up a fence doesn't necessarily mean it's just yours, because it's all held in trust. But this is different. This is a Texas rancher that actually went and came and bought this land in Oklahoma, and they use it for their own private hunting and fishing, if there are streams in there. So typically how this stuff works is game and fish departments will regulate how many tags, how many fish you can kill in a year. They measure these things. They'll monitor the population through surveying to get a total count, mark and capture techniques, to determine how often things are being killed, how often they're dying, and then they kind of extrapolate those samples that they take to say okay, here's a rough guesstimate of how much game is available every year. And based on that, based on a healthy healthy kill rate, healthy burn rate for that population, that okay, we can issue 200 deer tags this year. We can say that up to 200 deer can be killed. And of course, not every single one of them is going to be killed, because not everyone that gets a tag is going to be successful. But all of this is important because when I first saw this episode and they walked on the private property, I'm like, these guys are poachers. These two are poachers. Leon and Willie Jack, they don't have permits. They put on their orange like you're supposed to, because that's basic hunter education, and they're dressed up in their camo. But it's these guys are poachers. They're hunting without a permit. But I looked up on Oklahoma state law. Oklahoma state law says that you can hunt on private land at any time. Doesn't need to be in season. You don't even need to have a permit. You can hunt at any time as long as you have permission from the homeowner. Actually, I think it's during the hunting season. You have permission to hunt on private land as long as you have permission from the homeowner. And he says that's where their story about us technically owning this land and us not needing permission is important, because by letter of the law they should have approached those Texas ranchers and asked them if it's okay. But that's why that story is significant. And so going back to the game and fish part, he does say oh yeah, maybe they're poachers, not poachers like us, because game and fish, they'll monitor for things like climate change and monitor for disease like wasting disease, things like COVID where you don't have a hunt season. It affects the population, and in order to maintain a healthy balance in the ecosystem, they have to set bag limits. And you can kill X amount of things, or they'll incentivize the community to kill a certain amount of population, like boar in Texas, because they're rampant everywhere and they're destroying the ecosystem. And so I think that's a really interesting point that they bring up in this, is the hunting aspect of it, because natives, they did this for a living. They did this not for a living. They did this to survive. It wasn't for game. It wasn't for prizes. It wasn't for mounting the head on the wall like how it is, how it's become for some people. It's very much like a sport where it's a competition and it's bragging rights. When really in the past it was just about providing for your community, and it wasn't about any of that. So I really enjoyed this episode. I think looking at this, I'm not too sure how I feel about the poaching aspect of it, honestly, because they are poaching. They are going to private land that isn't theirs. As a person who's a responsible, game hunter, I just wouldn't do that. Like, that just kind of feels out of pocket to me. Like, it doesn't feel right. But to each their own. There are natives that don't use $20 bills because Andrew Jackson's on it. So everybody has their own perspective on ownership and land back. And I think that this is a really good picture to paint because there's such a variety of native beliefs, of like modern beliefs when it comes to like land ownership and game ownership, because it's a mixed bag. And I think that because natives all over the United States and really in other parts of the world, other indigenous nations, they're fighting just for their right to subsistence of farm, whether it's fishing or hunting, because of game and fish. Game and fish will say like, hey, we gave 200 tags already for the year. That's all we can afford to kill because this is an endangered species, because humans are killing this at an alarming rate. Meanwhile, natives are like, hey, I need to be able to kill enough to live off of this because it's how me and my family, me and my entire communities have lived for generations. And so you had these like fights with government entities and native people saying like who can and who can't take these game at large numbers. And of course, if natives can take it, then non-natives get mad because they're like, well, why are these guys allowed to commercial fish, or why are these guys allowed to hunt when it's not in season? It's like, what makes them so special? So to each their own. I mean, it's such a dynamic problem. Subsistence farming, subsistence game hunting. It's such a subsistence fishing. It's such a dynamic issue, and I really enjoy that. Unless you know about it, saying something as simple as, well, they might be poachers, not poachers like us, or just talking about how, they own the land before the Texas ranchers. I really think that says a lot, and I really enjoyed that. So when they get there, they put on their war paint, jokingly put on the war paint. Willie Jack puts like this costume paint from the Halloween store she got, gives it to Leon, and they both put it on. And going back to why I like this episode is the rest of this episode is them just sitting there and shows the reality of hunting, waiting. It's not like a river runs through it or Last of the Mohicans where it's all action. Running through the forest, like tracking your animal on foot and sprinting. It's like, no, you actually just wait. You spend more time waiting than you actually do hunting, and I really like that. And because during this interaction, Leon gets a chance to ask Willie Jack, he's like, okay, you mentioned you wanted to leave. Why do you want to leave? And I really, really enjoy this episode because of this conversation, this specific conversation of Leon talking about what happens when you leave, why do you want to leave? And it really goes deep without getting too... it says so much with so little. Because Willie Jack just wants to go because, shit, her friends wants to go. She says because Snoop Dogg's from there, Dr. Dre, shit, even Dr. Phil's from there. It's clear she has no idea why she wants to go to Cali. She just is convinced by her bros that, like, we're going to go to Cali. Daniel wanted to go, and as a dying wish... honoring his memory, which is a better way to say it, honoring his memory, we're all going to go to Cali and get the hell out. And she also mentions, like, hey, maybe I'll even become an MMA fighter. And this part's cool because in that sequence, when she says maybe an MMA fighter, it shows friend of the show, person who's been interviewed, Riker Six Killer. He's the person in the octagon with Willie Jack. She flips him over his shoulder, I thought that was pretty cool. And Riker mentioned that during our interview that they needed a guy to do another stunt outside of the one that he did in Uncle Brownie, and that's kind of the one that he's referring to because that's the only other time I seen him in this show, and that was freaking cool. So Leon, he's kind of poking and prodding of like, why do you want to go? He talks about what we all struggle with on the res, and I love this part. He tells her, you'll see. People leave here all the time. They come right back. Because this is where their people are. This is their home. And I really like that part because I struggle with that. I think a lot of Native people struggle with that. And so Leon is just like, once again asking, why do you want to go? Why do you want to leave so bad to LA? This is what's going to bring you back. What we're doing here, sitting in the woods, hunting. She's like, that is what you're going to miss the most. You're going to want to be here. And Willie Jack's like, I can't. My friends want to go. Daniel wanted to leave. Maybe if he left, he'd still be here. And that was really powerful when she said that, because we've lost so many of our friends and family on the res to different things, domestic violence, alcoholism, substance abuse, rape, murder, suicide, the list goes on. And it's all because of the place that we've been put on, whether it's by choice or we negotiated to get there, whether or not it's close to our ancestral homeland, or we're fortunate enough to be on our ancestral homeland. A lot of times we think, man, if they just left, or if they had never come back, or if only they were here, and maybe if only they weren't here, maybe they would have had a chance. Like, we thought all kinds of stuff when after somebody passes, because of what I mentioned before, all the litany of things that our communities are plagued with, like the awful dichotomy of being Native, where on one side you have your homeland, where your people are from, and where your people calls out to you like your homeland. It cries out for you when you're gone, and you miss it so much, like how Leon's describing it when you're gone. And you ache to go home because that's where your ancestors are from. You can feel it. You know it. Your ceremonies, your songs, your family stories, everything in your fiber is tied to that place. But on the other side of that is it's the same place that will kill you because of what it has become. It's such a messed up duality, like leave and survive or stay and die. And it's not absolute. It's not absolute at all. But for a lot of people, it is. So during this conversation where they're talking about why she wants to leave, they have this flashback of Daniel. And that's kind of what this episode is like talking about Daniel, what they used to do with Daniel, and something they did was hunt. And they have a flashback of Daniel when they're all sitting there, all three of them, of just, it's just sitting there hunting, sitting there waiting in the same spot that they're sitting now. And it's clear that, Daniel was a loose cannon based on their flashbacks. He's got a lot of anger, a lot of emotion that can go at the flip of a switch. And we see that exemplified in the captured really well in the next episode when he has that kind of altercation with one of the people at the bar. But we'll talk about that next episode. And what is crazy is just you forget about Tallman because of how engaging all of this is. You forget about what Leon saw at the beginning of the episode. And while they have this flashback with Daniel, Tallman is standing there watching them off to the side. They can't see him, but Tallman can see them. And further adding to the fact that, or buying into the idea that Tallman is Daniel's spirit. And so at this point, they're like, okay, so they got trail cams out here. Willie Jack has a picture of Chunk. He's like, where'd you get this? We don't have a trail cam. Because she printed that picture out at the beginning of the episode. So they go hunting for trail cams, trying to find this one that she took the photo from. And there's trail cams all over the place. And there's a nice little shot of them walking through, being silly, going through the forest, going through the woods. But while removing one of the trail cams, the one that they thought that took the picture of Chunk, two white guys start walking through. And I love the dialogue between the two. It's like two Texas ranchers, and they're just having this meaningless banter. This meaningless, this is what conservative white dudes sound like to these two people, because it's just like stock market, Dow's down. Cattle prices, beef price up, Mexicans. Investments, cancel culture, taxes, wokeness, government overreach, don't forget the gays. And then they just walk off. And so it's just like, God, that's what for some people, that's all they hear. Just like on the other side, conservatives, they hear just a bunch of the same, buzzwords. But I really like that interaction of just like how disconnected Native people are from all of that world. It's like that's what it sounds like to us. I'm sure they're having a very complex, in-depth conversation about what interests them, but to them, that's all it sounds like. And so they sit down, lay low while the white ranchers walk off. Leon tells the Willie Jack the story about Tallman. It's like, okay, I got to tell you something about why I've been the way I've been. One part of it is Daniel. I haven't been right for the past year because of Daniel, but also because he saw Tallman in the past year. Kind of describes what Tallman was, and that's where Willie Jack isn't even freaked out. I think a lot of places, in other shows would make this into like a eerie horror thing, but because this is just something we live with, this is just something that is a truth in our communities. It's just like, okay, that sounds like it's Daniel. It sounds like it was Daniel's spirit. It's not something that's like conflated to be like bad immediately, just like Dear Woman, just like Dear Lady. Like that's not immediately like a terrible thing where everyone's freaking out and looking over their shoulder. It's like, okay, I know what that is, and I'm very familiar with it. I grew up hearing stories about it. It sounds like that's what this is. And so Leon, tells her about Tallman, and Willie Jack's just like, might have been Daniel's spirit trying to say goodbye, because that's right after he killed himself. And Leon kind of just wraps up the conversation with telling her, like, it's okay to go to Cali. While he doesn't want her to go, he tells her, if you need to leave, I'll be here for you. I'll always be here for you. And they talk about Daniel's death and the circumstances around it. They're just like, this is like how you feel if you've ever lost someone to suicide. So, unfortunately, I've lost a good number of friends to suicide and family. And this conversation is very abrupt and short that they have, but it says a lot about, like, if you've been in that, you've been in it. You have that worry of, like, could I have done something? What could we have done? Did we not tell them we love them enough? Did we not hug them long enough? Should we have texted, called them more? Then you realize you're making it about yourself, and then there's nothing you could have done, and only honoring that part of them, only thinking about them, about that part of their life, doesn't honor their memory. And when we flash back to Daniel and Leon, the night of the suicide, there's proof of that, of how, like, it was out of his hands. There's nothing he could have done, because this is right after Daniel leaves Alora at the honky tonk. That's what he tells him. He's like, oh, we were at a honky tonk, and Leon's loading up that bag of corn into the back of the truck, and Daniel stands there, and he's just like, you need any help with that? You want any help? And for people that are like, oh, that was an opportunity, that though they could have had a bigger conversation, he could have invited him, but it's like, we don't know that would have averted this crisis, averted this suicide. Because what's powerful about this interaction is it is so uneventful. This scene proves that, could I have done anything different? No, you couldn't. I have a friend personally that I was texting right before he killed himself, and it played through my head over and over what I could have done. Nothing. There's nothing I could have done. At the time, after he, took his life, I thought, like, gosh, if I just said this, or man, if we just talked more, if I just picked up the phone and actually called him, maybe he wouldn't have done it. But then I look back at the text messages, like, we weren't talking about anything. We were just talking about the football game, that we just saw. It wasn't anything serious. Just like this conversation with Leon and Daniel. There was nothing in this that Leon could piece together, going back and be like, oh, okay, I could have done more. He's like, no, he saw Daniel was cold. He gave him a jacket out of his truck. He said, like, yeah, we're going to get you out there, man. We're going to go hunting. Letting him know, like, hey, I'm still going to care about you. You clearly got some stuff going on in your head, but, get that figured out. But we're going to go hunting. We're going to go out and get Chunk. We'll be all right, man. And then that was it. That's the last time anybody ever saw Daniel. There was no, I'm sad, man. I've been really down lately. I've been having these dark thoughts. Like, some people, when it comes to suicide, think that those are what people share. And a lot of times it's not. It's a surprise most times to people around you, because everyone always says, I never thought they would do something like this. I never thought that they were capable of doing this. All the funerals that I've been to of suicide, that's what it's been. It's such a fucked up thing. But this show is amazing for talking about it in this manner, because this is real in our communities. It is a problem among Native youth, a huge problem. I have the stat later on in my notes, but I want to say Native youth kill themselves at a higher rate, 3.5 times the national average. And that's just crazy. And this show is amazing for talking about it in this manner. And they don't show it, but they show the aftermath of the suicide in the next episode, but letting people know you're not alone. of like, this is a reality in our Native communities. And I really, really appreciated them talking about this because they didn't have to. They could have made it palatable. They could have made it very funny and just a goofy show, but they included some real shit that we struggle with constantly. And at this point, the tension, I shouldn't say tension, but the serious conversation is broken up by Chunk. They see it, the deer, they see Chunk. Willie Jack takes the shot. Episode ends with them riding off, and then throughout this entire episode, there was kind of this turkey that's been following them, and they ride off with the turkey, the live turkey. They didn't kill it, but it's alive in the back trunk, in the trunk of the bed, and in the truck bed, and they take off. And you know what I really liked about this part too is you kind of get this closure with Willie Jack and Leon as they're driving off with Chunk in the truck bed. You see Tallman standing there. You see his red eyes, and it just like disappears into the forest. And that is Daniel's spirit, kind of like disappearing off, kind of going off in peace in a way. Because then we flash to Leon and Willie Jack standing at Daniel's grave, and she tells them like, hey, they got Chunk. We're gonna have some backstraps tonight. I hope you're with Grandpa somewhere enjoying yourself. I hope you're hunting. And then this is where we get a very critical piece, is because with these individual episodes that we're getting with Cheese, Alora, Bear, and Willie Jack, we're getting an indication of whether or not they're going to go. Ultimately, we're trying to get a deep dive into who they are and are they wanting to leave. And every single one of them is no up to this point, because Willie Jack says it. Everyone wants to leave to California, but it's really hard leaving everyone here. I don't know how you did it. Maybe you don't even know, but I'm not mad anymore. Watch over us. Love you, bitch. And then the episode ends with a Creek hymn being sung. And I know it's a Creek hymn because shout out to Skoda and Cinema, Tyler Randall, because he posted about it on Instagram, and I thank you for providing the information. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known that they were singing it in Creek and Muskogee. And that was great. So once again, shout out to Tyler for that. So if you're unfamiliar with the show, we always do cast review, plot review, positive, negatives, final thoughts, take us home. So let's talk about some positive. This is some of the truest representation I've seen because it deals with something that is constantly an issue in our communities, suicide, specifically youth. As I mentioned before, I saw some stats from the CDC. Ages 10 to 24 is how they categorize youth in this particular survey. In this particular data set, I apologize, but Native Americans from 10 to 24 are 3.5 times more likely to commit suicide than the national average. Talk about a problem. Talk about a fucking problem that nobody's talking about outside of Native communities. And this episode spells out some of the hurt that we experience. This issue of leave the res for success, but only to be depressed because you're not on your homeland. And the ancestral homelands that you come from are calling out for you the entire time that you're gone. So you miss the place that you fought so hard to get away from. And then if you do stay, you stay because of your family. You stay because you don't have the ability to go. You don't think you can leave. You become depressed, unstable because you have so much anger and aggression from the crap around you. You get angry thinking about hunting every year on land that isn't yours, but it is yours. You say it's still yours, knowing it's not really yours anymore, based on the letter of the law. You cling on to your culture for dear life, only to see it slipping away with each generation. And what is left for you to do when you live in a house that is riddled with domestic violence, like Daniel's was? The only place you're supposed to feel okay and take sanctuary from the world and have solace is your home. From the res, from all the crap, from the alcoholism, from the substance abuse. You have your house, but the one place that you're supposed to have solace is your parents and your house, and Daniel doesn't even have that. So Daniel takes his life. This is a res story that doesn't get told in film and television. This is like on the level of real that like Chris Ayers' Skins, that movie Skins was, with Mogi, like demonstrating the alcoholism, what that really looks like in our communities. Like that was real. That was powerful. The depth of that reality that this show portrays is unmatched, frankly. I've never seen this, and this is amazing. I'm so happy they showed that. So as far as like the negatives, frankly, I need a little more context around Tallman. While I like that they included this, it's so tough to introduce a Bigfoot-like character with no background, no story. I have some Oklahoma Native friends who helped me out, but if it wasn't for them, I have no idea who Tallman is. If I didn't look this up online, I had no idea who Tallman is because we don't have Tallman in my culture. But I guess that's what this show is going for. You know, some stuff you get, some stuff you don't. Like, it's very clear that, like, Sterling and company just made this. Like, for them. They made it for Native people, but they made it also for them. So some of it they'll explain, but that's rare, you know. Most of it you're in on the joke or you're not. Just like the owl's eyes blurred out. That's something that you just get or you don't. But with Tallman, something like this, Dear Woman, they gave a little more explanation as to what she is and the mythology, kind of like the stories around her. But Tallman, they just kind of inserted him, and I feel like it's a little frustrating as a viewer to not be spoon-fed, I guess is what I'm getting at. And also with applying the costume paint, it's a joke. Applying Halloween costume paint, putting on war paint is, you know, kind of like ironic. But to me, it's like, don't be spreading that crap, you know? It's like we don't really do that intentionally when we're hunting. At least most hunters, you know. I'm sure some people still do. They do ceremony around it and they put it on, or you do a sweat before you go out and hunt. But applying war paint in that same way, I don't know. To me, it just wasn't for me, honestly. There's potential for that to be misconstrued for what it is. So let's talk about some final thoughts. So even though I had to look up Tallman and what Tallman is, I really enjoyed the Tallman part of it. After I learned what it was, learning that it really was like Daniel's spirit. It wasn't this like thing to be feared, because it was Daniel's spirit saying goodbye to his family in the way that he is able to do it through the spirit world. And I like this episode too because it's simple. It demonstrates why why home is so important. It's not just something as simple as like hunting with your dad on your homeland. Like, it hits different. And some of this, if you're not native and you're just like, this just seems like a small town feel, you know, if that's it, yes, it is. It's like a small town feel. There's a lot of small town feel to Indian country, but it's different because of what I mentioned of like the connection to place, the connection to land, the complexion, the connection to land and place and your ancestors. And there are people like, well, there are non-native people that will say, well, my people have been here for generations, and they try to relate to that. But it's different when your people have been here like in that area since time immemorial and have songs and ceremony tied to that place. And like for me, I live in Phoenix right now, but I wish for the day I can go back home for good, you know? I wish there was more opportunity to provide for my family so I could go home. And thankfully, like with remote work becoming so prevalent and the res internet is finally being not so terrible, and hopefully it gets to a point where it's like good enough that you can like that you can be like, oh, the res internet is not any different than everywhere else, and hopefully that day can come sooner or later, so that way you can just move there and work and work from anywhere, meaning work from the res. You know, when people talk about like, oh, you know, if I had like a work from home job, I would travel the world, I would go here, I would go there, I would go home. Honestly, that would be a dream, to be able to be home. And that's what we miss. And that's what I really liked about this episode, because it's so true. Once you leave, God, you want to go back. As soon as I graduated high school, I left Tuba City in the rearview mirror. I'm like, man, fuck this place, fuck everything here. I don't ever want to come back. I want to get as far away from my family and friends and this town and Navajo everything. I never want to come back. And what do? I go and marry a Navajo. I go and marry a Navajo woman. I have Navajo kids, and I can't not ever be separated from my homeland because it's home. But you have to leave to experience that. You don't know. And I think that's what I really enjoyed about Leon's conversation with Willie Jack, because even though he tells her, like, you're going to miss this place. What's better than this place? People leave all the time and they come back. He doesn't tell her, like, I have spoken and listen to me. He's like, you know what? If you feel like you got to go, go. But just trust me. What I'm telling you is the truth. But if you need to go see it for yourself, you go ahead and do that. I trust you. You're a good kid. You got a good head on your shoulders. I trust you. And that's like the best thing that I think a parent can do for their kid, is just give them trust to say, I trust that you're going to make the right decisions. And I just hope it brings you closer back to me, whatever your decisions are. And I really like that simple message. This episode was very, simple in that regard. And but it said so much. There were so many layers to this, and I really liked it. So let me know what everybody thinks of this particular episode. I've talked to, Elias Gold in our last episode, and he particularly didn't like this episode. I think it's a sliding scale for some people. Some of these episodes are really kind of meaningless. They don't advance the plot in the way that we would like to. We're not getting closer to California in the pace we would like to. There's 2 episodes left in this season, episode 7 and episode 8. And I'm excited to wrap this up because I have a few things brewing outside of the show that I'll talk about if they come to be. But Seinfeld got added to HBO Max. I want to talk about the Native American girlfriend in Seinfeld because Kim Guerrero, who is also in Reservation Dogs, is in that, and the cigar store Indian episode. And, I did a post on Instagram recently called Going Native. It's a trope in movies where the protagonist goes native, where they end up becoming a part of the native community, indigenous community that they're trying to overthrow. And why is that such a recurring trope in film? And why does it continue to be, recurring in movies like Dune recently? You can debate whether or not it's going native or whether it's a white savior movie or not. And I personally don't think it is. But going native, that trope is still there, where they have a mindset of like, those people are bad, those people are savages, those people are terrible, and then they go somehow end up being in their community, whether it's by choice or not. They become a part of that community by choice or being forced, and then they eventually see the error of their ways, of their colonial ways. And I think it's a very interesting trope to dig into that isn't talked about enough because there's so many movies that do that. Whether it's The Last Samurai, Dances with Wolves, as we've seen most recently with Avatar. So I want to do a few episodes on that. And there's just a lot of things that have been in the back burner, and I've really had not given the attention I need to this show. So I just want to say thank you so much for everyone who supported the show. I really appreciate it. We've done this show now for a year. I can't believe it's been an entire year since we started this podcast, and I appreciate everyone who's been here since day one, those of you that we've picked up along the way, and I can't thank you enough. All right, everybody. Talk to you later.